Millions of men and women have been killed in wars. For over 100 years, scientists have investigated claims that sometimes the dead are in touch with the living. Scientific surveys show those who died suddenly are most frequently seen again. So might these dead exist somewhere in another dimension? In war, many come close to death but recover. A number have what scientists call a near-death experience. They believe they glimpsed death but live to tell the tale. In October 1965, an American soldier in Vietnam saw himself in a dream, gun in one hand, a pair of crutches under his arm. A month later, when his frontline base came under mortar attack from the Viet Cong, Dave Cook had a typical near-death experience.
And the fourth round came over top of my head, and I turned and looked, and 6 feet away the round hit. And everything at that point seemed to go into slow motion, okay? I could see the rocks, the colors of them, and everything else, just the hole just starting to open up. And it was just lazily going through the air, it seemed like. Another round came in and just hit just a few feet from where that one was, and I see what had happened to me. Like the whole ground in front of me was red. Okay, my knee section from here to here was gone, and that was where I experienced this near-death experience. All right, that was that I lost so much blood that I was in convulsions and I lost my eyesight from bleeding to death. And at this point in time, my life went from when I was born, and I could see it in vivid technicolor. The purest colors that you could ever possibly imagine possible was here. And it went in just phases like this, and it just went right in front of my eyes until the present day. And after I went through my life here, there was a long black tunnel, and I presumed that it was square or rectangle because the light at the end was in a square. And it was way down at the other end. It was pure white. And as I proceeded down this tunnel, the rays and that at the end started projecting out, and I mean beautiful rays, and everything was peaceful and quiet. And as I entered this chamber here, you would have felt, or I felt at that time, that you'd have to squint, but because of the brightness of the light. But it wasn't in that fashion. It was so pure of a white, you just look all around you, and it was 360 degrees around me. And there was no spoken words or anything at this point in time. And so my answer to what I perceived was a question to me was, I screamed, "No, I want to see my son." And that's when the company exec officer, when I was back, and he yelled to the sergeant, "Give me a belt for a tourniquet."
A few months after Dave Cook lost his leg, his premonition came true. His first son was born. Today, medical science routinely brings people back from the brink of death. Gallup polls say millions worldwide have had near-death experiences similar to Dave Cook's. Most are convinced they truly glimpsed a dimension beyond death. There are others too who believe in contacts with the next world. They say that certain living people can speak to the dead.
Spiritualism, ladies and gentlemen, it is not about death. It's about life. Your loved ones are walking by your side. They're with you now. In this very room, there's a host of souls. They are here not because I am here, but because you are here. Somebody here knows Ian. Is it here?
My name's
Ian. Ian.
Yes.
Someone keeps coming to me here. I thought it could have been your father.
Spiritualism was founded in America last century. The visions and voices that seem to appear at some seances are claimed as manifestations of the dead.
And the other is D. So he's given me two initials.
Those are his initials.
Those are his initials.
Partly to investigate spiritualists, the Society for Psychical Research was formed in London in 1882. Its scientists put mediums to the test. The eminent inventor Sir William Crookes had just investigated the famous materializing medium D.D. Hume from America, whose powers were said to include levitation. Crookes set out to expose a fake, but his published report said the medium was genuine. He said Hume called on him and, before witnesses, made this accordion float freely in the air, playing a tune, Home Sweet Home. As a further test, Crookes put the accordion in this electrically wired cage. It continued to play. Over the past 100 years, the Society has accumulated volumes of claimed evidence for life after death. Much of it does not impress today's investigators.
The materializations that were produced then seemed to me to smack very strongly of fraud and conjuring all the way through, as indeed do ones that I have seen myself much nearer, the only difference being that whereas it was cheesecloth in those days, it's nylon net curtaining now. So I remain unconvinced by that aspect of things. Now, when it comes to the rather less striking physical happenings, like raps and object movements taking place in the vicinity of a medium, then I do think there is some quite striking evidence for this.
This experiment in table turning is by a group in London who say they've levitated a table right off the ground. It didn't happen when we recorded. Later we used an image intensifier to allow the group to work in darkness. The table stayed on the floor. The Victorian explanation for levitation was lifting by ghostly hands.
As far as physical mediumship goes, what's around today is absolutely minimal compared to what it was in the late 19th century. And there could be many reasons for this, including, of course, that now that we can virtually see in the dark with quite small bits of apparatus, it's extremely difficult for fraudulent mediums to get away with it.
Right, see, no problem.
The group sent us a video of one of their own experiments. They claim this is true levitation, not a fake. It's impossible for us to tell. Watch the table again in slow motion.
There's a lady here, and oh, she's so mischievous, is this lady.
Oh, yes.
And she was but a person that you couldn't help liking.
I loved her.
Yes, that's it. She's just written a name there. Is it Veronica?
That's right.
What's your name?
Veronica.
Well, there you are.
Mental mediums who relay messages from the dead have frequently intrigued investigators more than materializing mediums. The test is, do these mediums really display insights into people's lives they could not get by normal means?
Come on.
Yes.
Yeah. She says to tell you she's met Kitty.
Oh.
Yes, you know Kitty,
Yes.
don't you? Oh, and Flo. Florence, someone named Flo.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes.
And also Mrs. Cook.
Yes.
Yes?
And the mediums that we have had, the most famous ones, tend to be showmen and showwomen who like big audiences and the bright lights. It's impossible to assess in any unbiased and scientific sort of way what goes on in a public demonstration of mediumship. The only way one can go about investigating mental mediums is by bringing selected sitters to them in private, preferably persons whose identity they don't know. Now, this was how Mrs. Piper and Mrs. Leonard operated.
Some famous mediums of the past were tested by scientists for years under strict control. Mrs. Leonora E. Piper of Boston was the most celebrated trance medium. Her sitters were always introduced as Smith. She told complete strangers such astonishing truths, it was suggested she must be getting the information telepathically from the minds of the sitters. Doubts were cast on the telepathy theory by a series of worldwide communications known as cross-correspondences. Mrs. Piper in America and mediums in Britain and in India each received fragments of messages which only made sense when they were pieced together years later.
despite the fact that these mediums had off days, sometimes talked utter nonsense, or sometimes got it completely wrong. I don't see how anyone who reads this material carefully can avoid coming to the conclusion that Mrs. Piper and Mrs. Leonard regularly produced items of information that it is extremely difficult to see how they could have come by in any ordinary way.
The American medium Marjorie, wife of a Boston surgeon, was headline news in the 20s and 30s. Her spirit guide was her dead brother, Walter, killed in a railway accident. Walter became famous for simultaneous cross correspondences. Once Marjorie, in Boston, wrote 11 times 2 equals and to kick a dead. A telephone call disclosed the medium George Valentin in New York had written the figure 2 and no one ever stops. A telegram from Niagara Falls said another medium had also written 2 and HORSE. Put together, the overall message was 11 times 2 equals 22 and no one ever stops to kick a dead horse. Mrs. Marion L. Nestor is over 80. She's one of the last surviving witnesses of the Marjorie mediumship, and she's writing a book about it. Mrs. Nestor's father was the medium's chief investigator, Dr. Walter Richardson.
He was intent on finding something that would rule out fraud. He felt that they would be able to prove there was survival after death. So he invented as many mechanical things as he could to show different things. One was the independence of the voice.
Everyone at the séance held a tube between their lips. If someone spoke, water pressure was seen to drop. This device would show if anyone was pretending to be Walter's voice. Marjorie was tested publicly for many years. She was locked in a glass cabinet. She was bound hand and foot, but she still managed to make objects move and bells ring. The escapologist Harry Houdini said Marjorie was a fake. He tested her in this cabinet. At seances, the empty pan of a weighing scales dropped as if heavier than the weighted side. Under Walter's directions, mediums wrote in Chinese, a language they didn't understand. Rings made of different wood were said to be psychically joined. They could not have been carved like this. But this pair are no use as evidence. They were dropped, and one broke.
He was sure that what they found at Lime Street proved that there was survival, that an individual's mind and personality could survive. He was absolutely convinced. He felt he'd presented all kinds of tests and that she'd passed them all with glory. He never, as far as I know, he never doubted.
But was Marjorie genuine? So-called ectoplasmic hands left fingerprints of dead people in pads of wax provided by Marjorie's dentist. One set of prints was supposedly Walter's. It was said they matched his prints from an old razor, but a fingerprint expert said Walter's seance thumbprint on the left was identical to the thumbprint on the right, and they both belonged to Marjorie's dentist. It was a blow from which the medium's reputation never recovered. Marjorie posed the classic dilemma for investigators. If a medium is caught cheating, does it invalidate everything she's ever done? A scientific survey of apparitions at the hour of death was published in 1979. Hospital staff were asked about apparitions seen by dying patients in America and India. Of 900 patients in both countries, 2/3 said they were visited by a dead friend or relative who came to take them into the next world. 3/4 were willing to go with the apparitions. One of the authors of the report found this surprising.
Life is the strongest thing we hold on. And everything could be dropped, but we want to live. And here, they're ready and The nurses said they light up. Not disturb, but light up to go. Now imagine if a terrorist came in here with a power to take you away with a machine gun. How would you feel? I would have very cold feet. But here, something, the transcendental vista, the outlook, seemed to be so overpowering that the strongest instincts we have are overweighted. That impressed me.
An Indian pathologist took part in this survey. She was a patient who was seriously ill in hospital. She recalls a visit by her mother and a young student named Kirti.
While I was lying, suddenly I saw Kirti's grandfather coming in, and he was not a very tall person. He had, very thick specs on, and he had his usual dhoti, and he stood there at the foot of the bed, and he said, "Won't you send Kirti home?" And he was very persistent. So I got a little irritable, turned over, and he stood there again, and he said, "Please send the child back home." So when he persisted, at that time I decided to tell Kirti. So I told Kirti, please go home. And at that time I didn't mention that her grandfather was waiting, because I obviously thought that she might have seen him. So she said, "No, I won't go home." So I said, "No, you must go home." Then she said, "No, you're too unwell, and so I would like to stay with you." So I said, "At least please go and ring up from downstairs." So she went down and rang up and found that her grandfather had died about 5 minutes previously.
So I told my daughter, it was a very good thing, he was very strict with her. And then she told me that she saw the grandfather by her bedside, you see. And that's why she wanted Kirti to go home.
As a doctor, one doesn't really think that apparitions do happen. So one imagines that maybe it is due to my high temperature, I had a delirium, or I had a hallucination. But as Kirti's grandfather never came earlier, or I never thought of him either. So it was a very strange coincidence that just at his point of death, he should, I should get the apparition of him standing by my bedside.
I believe that she must have seen him, because I believe that people, just after death for some time, they do have power to reach and convey the message.
Despite differences in religious belief and death ritual in India and America, the survey of apparitions found that dying patients in both countries had similar experiences. There are many published surveys of people who come close to death but recover. Thousands of people in Asia and the West have had these near-death experiences. There's an international association for near-death studies. From their research has emerged the picture of a typical NDE.
The individual may leave their body. Their consciousness usually goes up onto the ceiling. Then, if the experience deepens, they go down a long tunnel, and then they see at the end of this long, dark tunnel a little speck of light which grows and grows in intensity, and it's usually described as white or golden, and they then come out into some sort of landscape. It's very different for different people, and quite often the landscape is populated with figures, some of whom are religious, some of whom are dead relatives, and some of whom aren't recognized at all. There is then usually a life review. Then there is quite often a decision. Do they go on into this landscape, and they know that if they do, they will die, or do they return to their bodies?
This 15th century painting is by Hieronymus Bosch. The naked figures are dead people being escorted into the next world. Many today believe Bosch painted a real near-death experience. The long black tunnel leading to the brilliant light is typical of thousands of modern recorded NDEs. A young woman was swimming in the ocean off New Jersey in America when she had an NDE. The seas were rough after a hurricane and the swimmer was soon in trouble.
I was thrown under the water and disoriented. I didn't know which way was up. There was a lot of, you know, some kind of rocks and sand, and my bathing cap was torn off, and I had long hair, and I just, in other words, thought, I just thought that I saw where people have a choice. You know, you can give up, because I was so tired. You know, I just didn't know how far I could keep going deep enough under these enormous waves so that I could not be part of the thing that made me turn over. Then all of a sudden, I just noticed that I saw a whole little flash, like, of my whole little life. I was only 15, but I saw this like a film, but like a circle. And then I just heard noises, and I just didn't know what was happening. I heard like church bells, crickets, and different, like the wind, but I didn't feel anything else. I didn't feel any pain or anything, and I had, you know, I didn't feel anything, really. And then the next thing I know, it's real dark, you know, like, and I'm afraid the dark was just black, velvety black. And then there was like this long tunnel, but not all black then, but with little lights like galaxies. And then it was bright, very bright, but like honey color, clear, but honey but not sticky. So it was like a really bright, warm feeling. And I looked and I saw very calm water going into this beautiful garden with 2 angels and some different people I didn't know, all there. And it was just so wonderful. I'd never seen anything like it. And I forgot where I was and everything. I didn't know. I just saw this, and I felt so wonderful. And, but then a voice came back to me and said, "Go back." And then it was a blinding flash of bright white light, not like the yellow golden light, but bright, bright white. And all of a sudden, it was funny, it was like putting a jacket on. I felt myself back into the ocean. But then all of a sudden, I turned toward shore, and it was as though someone was helping me. I just swam very easily all the way in.
Today, Anne Sharp is an established painter with a studio overlooking the waterfront. Her NDE changed her life.
Now I know this will happen to everybody. I do believe that there's life after death. I don't mean life maybe as we know it, but there is a whole different existence. And I got as far as being in this wonderful, wonderful life.
Descriptions of NDEs date back to antiquity. The Egyptian Book of the Dead says the deceased travels towards a brilliant light on a boat sailing along a black river. In the Tibetan Book of the Dead, a person meets a series of beings of light. To study modern NDEs, we went to Seattle, where a higher proportion of people recover from heart attacks than anywhere else in America. In part, this is due to Medic One, a fleet of mobile emergency units who treat heart attack victims the moment they arrive on the scene. So more people live to tell of their NDEs.
Okay, big girl, I'm just going to listen.
A research group called the Seattle Study was set up by Dr. Melvin Morse. They've studied hundreds of NDEs in children and in adults. The children were asked to draw pictures.
This is a picture drawn by a child who suffered an intraoperative cardiac arrest. And he perceived that he went down a dark tunnel, which he's drawn here, and then he saw a beautiful light at the end of it, a rainbow bridge. But he did not get as far as that light. This is a young girl who also had suffered an intraoperative cardiac arrest. And this is her picture of what heaven is, and you can see that rainbow comes back in again. This picture here, I think, gives you a good feeling of what the light is to these children. She described a beautiful light when she was in heaven, and you can see it's not just a light, but it's surrounded by hearts, and it even seems to be anchored on either side to these large hearts. And then here's two spirits, or people that she met in heaven, and you can see they even have hearts attached to them. So clearly this was a joyous and happy experience.
A small boy drew this before he died of leukemia. He had a vision that after death he would live with God in a crystal castle beyond a rainbow bridge. In the eyes of science, all these experiences are hallucinations.
The brain is a past master at making representations of the world. If the brain function is compromised by a near-death situation, then it makes discordant models. So instead of putting consciousness in the brain or inside the skull, it puts it on the ceiling. Instead of having an objective external world, you go into a world which is distorted, a hallucinatory world. Feelings of love and bliss are due to the fact that the structures which underpin these in ourselves are distorted by the near-death situation. So science has it wrapped up. Now, the only way of saying whether or not the scientific view is correct is this part about whether the brain is able to leave and obtain information that couldn't have been obtained through the senses. Now, there is some evidence that that may be correct.
A child drew this picture of her father running with her lifeless body to the emergency treatment area, chased by doctors and nurses. The girl said she saw it all from outside her body. It happened just the way she said. Dr. Morse has many such cases.
Prior to running across Crystal's story, I had thought the comatose patients were unconscious. She explained to me that she could actually see me while I was resuscitating her. And what was even more extraordinary was that she could give me all sorts of accurate details about what we had done to her. For example, she accurately reported that we had put a tube in her nose. She said, "First you worked on me in a big room, and then you took me to a little room where you put me into a big machine." And that was, of course, a 7-year-old child's description of being put into a CAT scanner, which in fact we did. She had never seen me before, and yet she claimed to recognize me and told her mother, "That's the one with a beard who was working on me."
Teenager Mark Botts shocked his parents when he was 5 by talking about a series of NDEs. He had them as a baby, less than a year old, when he was in a coma for 3 months. Dr. Moore says that tests show babies can remember things from the age of 7 months. Researchers from the Seattle study look for cases where out-of-body experiences can be confirmed.
I remember seeing like doctors and nurses down, and I remember seeing my bed, and there was like a wall that divided my grandfather and my mother hugging, and I couldn't get through the wall. It was like a big thick wall, and there was no way to get through it to go see him.
He said, "You were in the hall, and way down the hall, and Grandpa was holding you and you were crying." And he said, "I wanted to come to you, but I couldn't." And I thought, this child was in a hospital room, way down a hallway from me. I was around a corner, and yet he knew what I was doing at that moment. And he knew who was with me. He had no idea that his grandfather could have even been there.
And I just remember floating up, and I could see my body down below. And there was nowhere to go except up into a dark tunnel. And I started crawling into the tunnel, and the tunnel was like endless. It was like dark, you couldn't see no light, and time had no meaning. There was endless. You didn't know how long, I didn't know how long it was. I crawled in the tunnel, and eventually I made it to the top, and it got really super bright, and God appeared. And he said, "Would you like to go back home?" And I said, "No." And he goes, "Well, you have a purpose in life, and you need to go back."
Mark told his parents he knew what was happening when he was in a coma. He watched his parents playing with his toys. He saw a girl from the next ward having her hair washed. He described his own medical treatment.
I couldn't accept him, like he must be making it up, or somebody told you a story, and after he told us a few more things, what could I say? Just like, maybe you are telling the truth.
When he was telling us these experiences, he said, "Do you know," and he told us all about the IV. Again, he couldn't have been told, he didn't know about it, and yet he's telling us what he sees and what he remembers, and it's exactly what happened, which made us say, this is real. He knows what happened.
One theory is that NDEs might be memories of the birth process, going down a black tunnel from the womb and emerging into the light of the world.
There are several problems with this theory, the first being that patients who've had cesarean sections still have near-death experiences. And so those patients obviously are not traveling down a tunnel at all. But second, this theory really has a misunderstanding of the birth process itself. When an infant is born, they are not traveling down a tunnel face forward with their eyes open, but rather they are being squashed and smashed through a birth canal with their head flexed and their eyes closed.
The main debate is whether NDEs are hallucinations in a dying brain, a fantasy created to ease the trauma of death. Science accepts that people have NDEs, but can it explain them away?
Now, we have looked at brain processes, and we feel we can explain all of the aspects of the near-death experience except for the light. For example, when there is a cutoff of blood to the occipital lobes at the back of the brain, the patient would then experience tunnel vision. So if there was nothing else to the near-death experience, it could be neatly explained by science. We would then enter into a world of darkness and then simply die. And yet the children we interviewed did not say that the experience ended with darkness. At the end of darkness came a beautiful light, a light filled with complex emotional overtones, clearly not caused by a dying brain, because the entire brain would have to be working in concert to generate both a vision of light and complex emotional images. So it is obvious that this light is not coming from the dying brain.
We could disprove the current scientific view of NDEs, that it's all malfunction of the machine, if we could set up the following experiment. If we were to paint symbols, say, on the recovery room ceiling, and the NDE was able to obtain this information not through their senses, this was repeated in a number of people, then science would have to acknowledge that in some way information could be transferred from the ceiling to the patient, and that the patient's account that his consciousness traveled and picked it up would then have to be considered seriously. I might say if we did this, we'd have to rewrite our present scientific views of the world.
Coming in, get that room ready, up the light in case you have
An NDE that's important to the scientific debate occurred in Seattle in April 1976. Maria, a 50-year-old woman, had collapsed in the street. In hospital, she had a full cardiac arrest.
Maria? Maria, are you okay? Maria, I need some help in here. Maria, talk to me.
What happened?
She went flatline. Get the ambu bed.
I happened to be in the doorway, just watching all the hubbub that happens when someone in the hospital is in cardiac arrest. I was witness to the fact that Maria had no heartbeat and no respiration.
Okay, get the drugs ready. We need an amp of bicarb, 2 amps of bicarb.
Later, Maria told the hospital social worker what she thought happened to her when she was apparently dead.
No family. 1, 2, 3.
She found herself up at the ceiling level in the corner of her room looking down on the proceedings. And she did, in fact, tell me who was in the room, what they were doing, what the equipment was doing. She had everything completely accurate, and I didn't believe her. There's a psychological term called confabulation that we as people do when we don't know how we get from point A to point B. We kind of fill in the blanks. And that's what I thought Maria was doing. She proceeded, though, to tell me that she was distracted by something out of the window. And just by thinking of where she was going, she was there. And she found herself hovering above the emergency room of the hospital. She also proceeded to describe it exactly, with how the doors automatically opened, how vehicles, that they came in from one direction and left by another. All of this I knew to be true. Then she said she was further distracted by an object on the 3rd floor of the building, but in a different part of the hospital. And the real reason that she was upset It's because she wanted me to go find this object. It was a tennis shoe, and she wanted me to get the shoe. I wanted to go home. This was weird, but I wanted to be fair to Maria, so I went outside, walked around that part of the building, looked up, I didn't see a shoe. I then proceeded to go from room to room to room. And about that time that I was thinking that I wasn't going to find the shoe, I looked down and found the shoe. And it was an incredibly jarring experience for me. Then I hightailed it back to the coronary care unit, but for some reason I decided to put the shoe behind my back. And I walked into the room far more calmly than I was really feeling. And I asked Maria to describe the shoe again. And for the first time I asked her what color it was. What color was it?
Azul. It was blue. It was blue, yes.
Maria, I have your shoe. I was holding a blue tennis shoe. I had no choice but to believe that this woman, who was by all accounts dead, had been out of her body when her body was no longer functioning. And right then, my whole perspective about life and death shifted for me, because Maria was really my great teacher. De nada.
Science accepts that people have near-death experiences, but explains them as fantasies created by a dying brain. Some scientists disagree.
I feel that we've advanced our understanding to know that at the point of death, all human beings will undergo a sensation of leaving their body and traveling towards a beautiful, loving light. This obviously conflicts with a materialistic worldview. The most simplest explanation for why people would think they're leaving their body and traveling towards a beautiful light would be that, in fact, they are. If we want to apply Occam's razor to this situation, which is that the simplest hypothesis to explain data is usually the correct one, then the simplest explanation to explain our data is that human beings actually have a soul that leaves their body at the point of death.